This is part 3 of our semester review for the course Implementing Policy and Regulation in Educational Settings. Previously, on the earlier 2 review videos, we talked about the origins of public policy and how education policy is different, and then we talked about the political considerations, cultural context, and some of the macro numbers necessary to understand the policy-making environment. This video transitions us into a more specific set of information. In particular, we'll talk about the decision-making framework, how to identify policy alternatives, the identification of resources and data necessary for policy-making processes, and then we'll begin to discuss how to decide among alternatives using economic analysis. And most of this video is focused on how to evaluate costs for different policy options. We discussed in class that there is a need to understand discounted cash flow and the DCF analysis framework. We talked about how you can, and we touched on this in the last video, about how it's mathematically possible to understand a future amount of investment or costs or benefits when discounted back to today's time using the discounted cash flow analysis protocol. So take a look at these other videos if you don't remember or understand how that works, and be prepared to answer questions about how discounted cash flow analysis would work on a project or policy basis. This is important when considering policies that span, or projects that span multiple years or multiple periods of time. So you may recall that we talked about this scenario of a young person named Pat. Pat we use as a metaphor for people that are developing multi-year plans and policies and procedures. So I'll refresh you on Pat's story, and hopefully you'll see some of the decisions that have to be made in any policy making or project space. So Pat saw that there was a need in his community for more refreshments, and we're using a lemonade stand here as the topic. So Pat thought, how can I make a lemonade stand that would help serve the community? He came up with several different ideas, from the mobile lemonade trailer to a more fixed lemonade stand that had a unique location and was permanent. But in reality, Pat estimated the startup costs for the different options. He knew that he had to make some decisions up front before he could define the complete outcome, or the complete lemonade stand that he wanted. So he evaluated the startup costs, including all of the direct expenses and the indirect expenses, including things like wages, benefits, materials, legal fees, the variable costs of the lemons, the cups, and the sugar, for example. All of those things Pat tried to estimate. And he came up with different models. A simple lemonade stand might cost a few dollars to start, while a more expensive, more luxurious lemonade stand had substantially higher costs. Now imagine that represents different policy options. There is one policy mechanism that doesn't cost very much to implement, but it doesn't have all the bells and whistles or all of the features of another policy option. So Pat estimates the startup costs and then tries to understand the economic benefits of those different models, because Pat ultimately wants to, in this case, make the most profitable lemonade stand possible. So the costs are just one side of the assessment. Pat needs to try to understand the economic benefits, or in this case the sales, from a potential lemonade stand. And it turns out that these things are much harder to predict, for a child at least. how many sales would there be, what kind of demand is there, what kind of pricing is optimal within the market, what are the influence of external factors like temperature on the sales or his ability to implement a good solution. So with all of these benefits in mind, Pat realized that he didn't have the data necessary or the analytical skills necessary to come up with a good estimate of the benefits. So rather than conduct a cost-benefit analysis, Pat conducted a cost-effectiveness analysis. And a cost-effectiveness analysis, in short, is comparing multiple options on which one costs less to achieve a comparable outcome. And the outcome that Pat wanted was to create and launch a lemonade stand. It wasn't to create and launch a fancy lemonade stand, it was just a lemonade stand. So the cost-effectiveness analysis was conducted, and that eliminated the need to estimate benefits. And so Pat launched the lemonade stand. With the first stand, over time, Pat sold some lemonade and there was some growth. And as the sales of lemonade continued to grow, more expenses were incurred. These are called variable expenses because they go up in proportion to the sales of the service or product, in this case lemonade. So as things grew, as sales grew, and Pat had a busier and busier lemonade stand, he had to reevaluate what he knew about his business. And so he started to collect new data, and this might be parallel to the incremental policymaking process that we talked about earlier. At the beginning stages, Pat didn't know how to estimate the volume of sales that would be made. Now, after being in business for a period of time, Pat is more able to estimate the sales, and that's a new source of data. So he's able to reevaluate the projections and to re-estimate what might be possible in his business. So as sales grew, it became clear that there was an upper limit to how much lemonade could be sold at Pat's lemonade stand. And so he needed to create more stands and more places for lemonade to be sold. And after reinvesting some of the proceeds from the earlier sales to improve technology, moving from a handheld juicer to an electric juicer on the right, the capacity went up. These investments would not have been made at the beginning based on what Pat knew about sales forecasting. So what we can see here from a policy standpoint is that sometimes you have to have some variability in your projections to account for both positive results and sometimes negative results. In this case, the positive result is that more sales than were expected actually happened. And so that meant that even though Pat had to buy more and more equipment, it was in response to a positive situation with his business. So sales continued to go up. They went up very quickly. And so Pat decided to look again at other machines that would help. So he reinvested in a much larger way this time into a commercial juicing operation and also into a mobile lemonade stand. And while this might have been Pat's initial hope to get to a mobile lemonade stand, it was not at all clear that you could arrive at this stage when Pat originally estimated what the sales would be. So at any rate, this represents the need to be flexible with from time to time with policy implementations as well as projects, because you might find that demand is higher than you expect, or that there are other circumstances that cause you to really reevaluate the business model or the organizational model or the policy structure that you might have originally intended. So to finish out this story, Pat concludes the year having invested in new equipment and mobile and permanent facilities, and he also franchised to get the lemonade stand widely distributed throughout the community. And so Pat's Lemonade Company continued to make more and more investments. The key takeaway of this story, although there have been many points made, the key takeaway is that projections of multi-year projects and policy ideas have to use the best possible information that's available at the time they are estimated at the beginning. And then as those policies are implemented or as those projects are underway, it's very important to keep enough flexibility in the financial projections so that you can update them. Because about halfway through the year, Pat could see that the projections for the rest of the year were very good and very strong, and that encouraged him to reinvest in the additional equipment. But he couldn't have seen that that would have been the case at the very beginning of the project. So keep in mind, multi-year projects or multi-year policy solutions have to have good data at the beginning, but you have to be flexible enough to reevaluate as you move through those projects. There was also a homework assignment during the second half of the course where we talked about watching Bill Gates' speech on how the U.S. education system fails, or at the time failed, to produce highly skilled workers. And just a reminder, if you hadn't already submitted your homework assignment for that, you need to do so or risk not getting any points on that assignment. But to bring it back to the final exam, you should rewatch that speech and the Q&A session afterwards, because there will be questions from that video on our final exam. And that brings us to the next topic, which will be specifically focusing on cost analysis in terms of cost-benefit analysis, specifically about benefits estimation.